Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK, and this video is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. We have a game featuring murders at Karlov Manor commanders, and Scott is playing Duskana, the Rage Mother. He's going to have a bunch of manifest, morph, and disguise creatures filling his ranks. I'm playing Mirko, Obsessive Theorist. I'm going to fill up my graveyard, make Mirko super big, and reanimate diabolical threats. Next, we have Chris playing Demon Tribal with Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, at the helm. He'll make his opponents sack a bunch of stuff and deal tons of damage. And we have Kyle playing Alquist, Prof, Master Sleuth. It's an Azorius artifact deck that can combo out. Use the link in the description to order your Murders at Karlov Manor product, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Scott kicked us off by playing a Spire Garden as his land for turn, and then passing it over to me. I drop an island as my land, and then say go over to Chris, who plays Restless Vents. Enters the battlefield tapped, and then he passes to Kyle. He plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and he passes it back to Scott. No Soul Rings on turn 1, you say. Scott plays a forest, and then casts an Arcane Signet. Secret Lair drop. He passes the turn back over to me. I play a swamp as my land, and then I cast a Dimir Signet, getting a little bit of ramp action of my own. I pass back over to Chris, who plays a Foreboding Ruins as his land, revealing a swamp from his hand, therefore entering the battlefield untapped. He casts Thrill of Possibility, pitching a card from his hand in order to draw 2 cards. That's so many more cards. He then passes back over to Kyle, who plays a Plains as his land, and then casts an Arcane Signet of his own. Afterwards, he passes the turn over to Scott. He draws, and then he plays a Forest as his land, and then he casts a fancy new MKC card in the form of a Panoptic Projector. This makes his face-down cards cheap, and doubles up on their triggers if they're flipped. Then he activates it, reducing the cost of a face-down card by 3 generic mana, so he gets a Mysterious Creature as a 2/2. It's very mysterious. He passes the turn over to me, I draw, and then I play an island as my land, and then I cast Deranged Assistant, a mana dork that also mills me a card, because I want stuff in my graveyard. Afterwards, I pass over to Chris, who draws and plays a swamp as his land, and then he casts Night's Whisper, drawing 2 more cards and losing 2 life, right where I want him. He then passes the turn over to Kyle. He draws and plays Seat of the Synod as his land, and then he casts Thousand Moon Smithy, therefore gaining a white gnome soldier artifact creature token that gets bigger with the amount of artifacts and or creatures that he has. We don't have the token. But yeah, it's like a Karnstruct, but it's a gnome, so it's better. On Scott's turn, he plays Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, therefore making everybody's lands forests. Then he activates his projector once again, getting another cheaper, mysterious creature. Afterwards, he casts Mastery of the Unseen, therefore gaining 1 life every time that he turns something face up. Then he plays Wilson, Refined Grizzly, a very distinguished gentleman. Kinda takes the bear tribal thing a little too seriously. Scott moves into combat, swinging a 2/2 at me, and I just take the damage. Then he passes the turn, I play another swamp as my land. I activate my Deranged Assistant, milling a card. It's a land. Then, I cast my commander Mirko, Obsessive Theorist. Sadly, I don't have any 0 power creatures in my bin, so I pass the turn with no end step effect. On Chris's turn, he plays a mountain, and then casts Read the Bones. So he'll scry 2, draw 2 cards, and lose 2 more life. Got him. Didn't like his scried cards, so those bad boys went to the bottom. He drew 2 fresh ones, and then passed the turn over to Kyle, who plays Alquist, Prof, Master Sleuth. And when that ETBs, he gets to investigate, therefore gaining a clue token. He then decides to hang back on defense and passes the turn over to Scott. He draws, then he plays Xenagos, the Reveler. This thing can make him some mana or make him 2/2s, and turns out that's what Duskana wants to do. So he zeroes it and makes a 2/2 satyr. After that, he activates Disguise on his true identity that was turned face down. And because it was turned face up, Master of the Unseen will trigger twice, so he goes to 46 and gets to scry 1 as well. Then he gets to draw a card, all thanks to his true identity. He found a land with that, so he plays a mountain as his land for turn. Then, unfortunately, we have a minor technical glitch, but here's what happened. At the end of Scott's turn, I cast a Consider, surveilling 1, drawing a card, then found a Curate, surveilled 2, and drew a card. This triggered my commander twice. I put a Grey Merchant of Asphodel to the bin, then on my turn, I played a Fabled Passage, cracked it, got an island, and here we are. Sorry about that, the camera must have cut out. I activate my Deranged Assistant, milling 1 card, generating the mana, which I use to play Commander's Plate. With that equipped onto my commander, it gets even bigger and gets some added protection, and we love that. I then play Dimir Informant. When that ETBs, it surveils 2, once again triggering my commander, giving it another +1/+1 counter. I put one of those cards into my graveyard and keep the other one on top. Then I move into combat, attacking Scott, who appears to be my biggest threat. I smack him in the air, dealing him a bunch of commander damage, and then I move into my end step. My commander will trigger, and I'll get back a Fairy Dream Thief from my graveyard out onto the battlefield. It enters the battlefield with a finality counter on it, so it'll exile if it was to die. This surveils 1 as well, therefore giving my commander another +1/+1 counter. I pass the turn, and then Chris plays the Black Gate as his land for turn, entering tapped. Then he casts Soul Shatter, so each one of Chris's opponents has to sack a creature that's the highest mana value. And I don't like that. Thankfully, mine is tied with my commander, so I put my Dimir Infiltrator into the bin. Kyle had to lose his Alquist, and Scott lost Wilson. On Chris's end step, Kyle plays Deduce, so he draws a card and gets to investigate as well, making a clue. And then on to Kyle's turn proper. He'll draw for turn, and then he plays an island as his land, and then he casts Tamiyo's Journal. This thing will investigate on his upkeep, and he could sacrifice 3 clues to go and find something from his library. Must be nice. He passes the turn over to Scott, who plays Neheb the Eternal. This could potentially get Scott a whole bunch of mana on his second main phase. And he greedily attacks Chris in order to generate that mana, dealing Chris 4 points of damage with his 2 attackers. Then Neheb triggers, generating 4 red mana. In his second main phase, alongside his Arcane Signet, he uses that 4 mana to flip over Experiment 12 with its Disguise ability. He triggers all of his stuff, so he'll gain 3 life times 2. He gets to scry and draw a card. And his Experiment 12's triggered ability triggers an additional time. Can you believe it? He found a forest off of his draw, and he plays that as his land for turn. He activates his Xenagos, getting another 2/2 Satyr. Afterwards, he passes the turn over to me. I draw, and then I activate my Deranged Assistant, milling 1 card and floating a colorless, which I then use to cast Contingency Plan. This thing says Surveil 5. There's a bunch of errated cards on the Magic the Gathering card database, the Gatherer, that now say Surveil. So, Contingency Plan does in fact say Surveil 5. This will trigger my commander once again, getting another +1/+1 counter, and I put a bunch of cards to the bin, including a Vilis Broker of Blood, while Scott shows off a picture of his cute puppy. After all that surveilling, I decide to cast Extract from Darkness, having each player mill 2 cards, and I get to reanimate something from a graveyard. So we all start milling some stuff. I know that my graveyard has the juiciest targets, but I'll also be triggering my commander at my end step, so I look at Chris's graveyard and see that he has an Archfiend of Depravity that he just milled, so I decided to reanimate that bad boy, getting another 5/4 flyer that will help keep my opponent's boards clear. I move into combat, swinging my commander at Scott and my Dream Thief at Kyle. They take their beats. Afterwards, I move into my end step. This will trigger my commander and allow me to reanimate Vilis Broker of Blood, seeing that Mirko has a whopping 9 power and Vilis is 8. So Vilis enters the battlefield with a finality counter on it, and I'm fine about it. I pass the turn over to Chris. He plays a Seer Step Pathway as his land for turn before casting Rakdos, the Showstopper. And once that enters the battlefield, Chris is going to start flipping coins. For each non-demon creature, he has a chance of blowing it up. So odds means that they die, and evens means that they live. Kyle lost his gnome, Scott loses a satyr, has a couple of creatures that survive, such as his Neheb and his Experiment 12. He loses a second satyr, and onto my stuff, I lose my Deranged Assistant. I have 2 demons in the form of Archfiend of Depravity and Vilis, and my Dream Thief survives, and finally getting to Mirko, my commander, he dies. My sadness hits the stack as I realize all of the work I have to do in order to get Mirko back online. At any rate, Chris passes the turn over to Kyle. He draws, and then he kicks his turn off by cashing in 3 clues to Tamiyo's Journal in order to go fetch up one of the best cards of his library. He finds the One Ring, which is pretty good. So that's going to have him gain protection from everything until the beginning of his next turn. He taps it, adding a burden counter and getting to draw a card before playing Talisman of Progress. Kyle cleans up his board state a little bit before passing the turn over to Scott. He draws and plays Uncivil Unrest. So not only do his creatures have Riot, but creatures that deal damage that have a +1 counter on it will deal double damage. He activates his Projector, putting something face down for cheap. Afterwards, he activates his Xenagos, this time plussing it, therefore gaining manas equal to the number of creatures he has. He then uses a portion of that in order to Megamorph his Den Protector. By the way, he gave it haste with Riot. And because he turned Den Protector face up, all sorts of things triggered. It gets a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it, thanks to getting turned face up as well as Experiment 12. Then he gains some life, and he gets to scry one and draw one as well. Scott's Projector is enabling an awful lot of value given his archetype. He then casts Kaust, Eyes of the Glade. He then moves into combat, swinging at myself and Chris, hoping to draw a card after dealing Chris some damage. Because of Uncivil Unrest, Chris decides to block, and rightfully so, because he'd be taking a bunch of damage. I, however, am not a coward. I take all the damage and Villas triggers. I draw 24 cards. Scott thinks he's got me on the ropes, but with seeing that many cards from my deck, I'm optimistic. After combat, Neheb triggered, getting him a bunch of mana. He uses his Arcane Signet to then manifest the top card of his library thanks to Mastery of the Unseen. He plays a land for turn in the form of his Terramorphic Expanse that he got back to his hand with his Den Protector earlier in the turn. He gets a Plains from cracking that. And on his end step, Scott has to sack down to only 2 creatures because of my Archfiend of Depravity. On my turn, I play a Command Tower, followed by a Stitcher's Supplier and that beautiful anime artwork. I mill the top 3 cards of my library, hoping to hit something juicy. I then cast Concoct, surveilling 3, and then returning a creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield. Because of my low life total, I decide to find that Gary, aka Grey Merchant of Asphodel, that I surveilled away earlier on in the game. So when that enters the battlefield, it'll look at all of my black mana pips. My devotion was equal to 9, so I drain each of my opponent's 9 life, and then I get to gain 27 whole life in return. That'll bring me to 41 life, and I feel pretty safe for now. I move into combat, and I repay in kind Scott by attacking him with Villas and Archfiend, and I ping Chris for 1 as well. Afterwards, I pass the turn over to Chris. He draws, and then he plays Blood Crypt, having it shock in for 2 damage. He then casts Blood Gift Demon, hoping that he could draw some extra cards at the beginning of his upkeep. He then casts Sheoldred's Edict, having each opponent sacrifice a creature. Kyle has none on his battlefield, so is unaffected, but Scott sacrifices his Neheb, and I put my Grey Merchant of Asphodel back into my graveyard, and I'm fine about it. On to Kyle's turn, he makes a clue on his upkeep, draws for turn, activates his 1 ring, putting another burden counter on it, and drawing 2. He plays Glacial Fortress as his land for turn, before casting Veldelkin Archmage. So now whenever he casts an artifact spell, he gets to draw a card. He casts a Mirror Retriever. When that thing dies, he gets to return another target artifact from his graveyard to his hand. He drew off of his Archmage. Then he casts Esper Sentinel. And when he casts that, it also lets him draw once more. He then passes the turn, and in a moment he'll kill his Mirror Retriever thanks to my Archfiend of Depravity. On Scott's turn, he moves right into combat. He still assesses me as the biggest threat, so he smashes into me, and once again I take the damage, dropping to 17 and drawing 24 more cards. He's doing everything in his power to knock me out of the game. In his second main phase, he once again manifests the top card of his library. It has Riot, and he has it enter with a +1/+1 counter on it. He then turns it face up, revealing that it's a Seedborn Muse. This will once again trigger all sorts of permanents on his board. He gains a little bit of life, gets more +1 counters on the Seedborn Muse, gets to scry one, and draws a card. He then activates his Projector, therefore getting a discounted face-down thing in the form of a mysterious creature. Following that, he moves to his end step and forgets that, once again, my Archfiend of Depravity will have him sacrificed down to 2 creatures. So he kills the thing that he just paid for. Onto my turn, I draw. I play a Swamp as my land for turn before casting Sir Conrad the Grim. This guy's going to start pinging anytime I'm messing with creatures in my graveyard. I reanimate. a Massacre Worm from my graveyard. This will have me lose 6 life, but that's okay. When Massacre Worm moves from my graveyard into my battlefield, Sir Conrad will trigger, pinging each one of my opponents for 1. And because I lost some life, Villas will trigger and I'll draw a bunch of cards as well. When Massacre Worm entered the battlefield, it shrunk creatures -2/-2, killing 2 of Kyle's creatures, therefore triggering Sir Conrad and Massacre Worm, dealing damage and draining my opponents. I then cast Animate Dead, targeting my Grey Merchant of Asphodel once again. When I remove that from my graveyard to the battlefield, it triggers Sir Conrad, pinging my opponents 1 more time each. Then Gary will enter the battlefield, seeing all of my devotion to black, and draining my opponents a whopping 15 life each. I will then gain 45 life, going all the way to 56. I feel quite comfortable with my position, so I move into combat, swinging at Scott, Kyle, and Chris in such ways that I present lethal combat damage. Chris has no effects and is going to die, so he decides to block my Stitcher Supplier just to get some more damage out to his other opponents. Scott responds by manifesting the top thing from his library, and Kyle has a response in the form of a Pongify. He targets my Villas. Now, this won't kill Villas, it'll exile instead, but I still get a 3/3, just no triggers from Sir Conrad. Then we resolve the combat damage. Kyle is safe for now, but Chris and Scott are both knocked out of the game. With Stitcher's Supplier dying, it triggers Sir Conrad, and it gets 1 point of damage off to Kyle, dropping him to 5. I mill 3 and find no other creatures there. However, I have a massive grip of cards, nearly 30 of them in my hand. So I move to my end step and have to discard down to hand size, so Sir Conrad sees all of the creatures entering my bin, and I have enough damage to knock Kyle out of the game. That makes me the winner, and as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it, that's the game. So we've been enjoying the Murders at Karlov Manor set so far. Be sure to get your product by using the link in the description. Let us know what you thought about the game in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.